Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the latest segment of Effecting Change, EFF's live stream series, where our panelists tackle the latest issues in civil liberties and human rights in the digital world. I have a few housekeeping items before we get into the show that you came for. We have a live caption team online with us today. You can view the captions at livestream.eff.org. And also at that location, you can participate in the Twitch chat for this live stream. If you have questions throughout the program, please drop them in the chat, and our guests will answer as many as they can at the end of the conversation. If you're comfortable, we encourage you to go ahead and type a hello in the Twitch chat window right now and let us know from which part of the world you're joining us. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF is a nonprofit composed of technologists, activists, and attorneys. Since 1990, EFF has been fighting for your right to create, innovate, and make yourself heard by anyone willing to listen without fear of unjust government or corporate surveillance. You are the reason EFF can take on this important work. If you'd like to help us in the fight to defend your digital freedoms, please consider donating at eff.org/supportchange or by picking up some cool EFF gear at eff.org/shop. My name is Mitch Stoltz. I am the Intellectual Property Litigation Director at EFF. I work on cases where copyright and trademark law are misused for censorship and fight changes to the law that are bad. I also lead EFF's competition working group, where we look at the effects of market power and monopoly on users' rights. It's my honor today to introduce the participants in today's discussion. Wendy Liu is the author of Abolish Silicon Valley, How to Liberate Technology from Capitalism. Wendy is based in San Francisco. And Cory Doctorow is a science fiction author, activist, and journalist. His latest book, Enshittification, Why Everything Suddenly Got Worse and What to Do About It, is what we're talking about today. His next book is The Reverse Centaur's Guide to Life After AI, coming in June of this year. As a reminder, we'll have about 15 minutes for your questions at the end. So if we haven't touched on something that you want our panelists to talk about, please ask. You can submit your questions via the Twitch chat at any time. And now, Wendy, I'm turning this over to you.
Great. Thanks, Mitch. Hi, everyone. And hi, Cory. It's good to be on a sort of virtual stage with you again. So just a few weeks ago, we did an event about Enshittification, this wonderful book right here. And it's great to have the chance to talk to you again. Cory, I always tell everyone, you are the most knowledgeable person I know on these topics. And every time I talk to you, I feel like I'm learning so much. And so maybe just to start off this discussion, maybe I could give you the chance to share some of your knowledge with us. So please tell us how did the internet get so much worse? And just set the stage for us. What is Enshittification?
Well, thank you very much, Wendy, and thank you for your kind words. I have to say, if I seem knowledgeable, it's only because I plunder my EFF colleagues' much deeper knowledge of so many facts. I am the guy who is 1 inch deep and 10 miles wide, and I work with a group of people who are 10 miles deep. So they are the fonts of all knowledge. So I work for EFF. I've been an activist with EFF now for almost 25 years. And the job of a tech activist is the job of getting people to engage with policy questions that are abstract and in the future. And for very good reasons, people mostly care about things that are concrete and in the here and now. And so you kind of got to convince them that this stuff that's like a very long way away and kind of hard to get your head around is worth thinking about. And so for years and years, I've come up with all these different parables and metaphors and narratives. I write science fiction novels. I've written dozens of those. But in the end, it turned out that a dirty word was all it took, a minor license to vulgarity. And Enshittification is both a description and a theory. So it's a description of how the platforms that we depend on go wrong, and it's a theory about why they're going wrong and what to do about it. And the description is pretty straightforward. You have platforms that are good to their end users. They find a way to lock them in. With social media, it's very easy because it's just hard to coordinate with all your friends to leave. Economists call that the collective action problem. But with other platforms, there's like more complicated ways of locking people in. Like when you're on Amazon, maybe you're paying for a year's worth of Prime in advance, and so it just doesn't make any sense to shop somewhere else. And then because of that, stores start to go under, or they become Amazon sales stores, and so now really everything is for sale there. With Uber, they lost 41 cents on the dollar for 13 years. They spent $31 billion of investor money, mostly from the Saudi royals. And they just put a bunch of cab companies out of business and induced a lost decade of transit investment. And so it's just hard to find an alternative. So they lock you in. And once you're locked in, they can make things worse and know that you're unlikely to leave. And so they make things worse in order to improve things for business customers. So, Facebook went from saying, oh, we're the social media platform that's not like MySpace because we don't spy on you the way they do. And they became this platform that does spy on you. Google bought all the places where you might find a search box. They pay Apple $20 billion a year not to enter the search market. And then they just made search worse. So you'd have to search more than once in order to get your results, and they could show you ads more than once. So, they're able to make things worse in order to make things better for business customers. And the business customers get locked into, I think a lot of us have heard, if you're not paying for the product, you're the product. It's kind of, I don't like that saying. I think it makes us think that, humane treatment is a customer loyalty perk and not something that firms extend to you if they are worried about losing your business or getting sued or losing their workers or, having a new company enter the market to unrig the products that they've rigged, and so those business customers, they also get it in the neck. Uber drivers are paid less. Amazon platform sellers have to pay more. It's now up to 50 to 60% of every dollar that you spend, Amazon captures, and they're only giving like 40 to 50% to the platform sellers. Apple and Google are taking 30 cents out of every dollar you spend there. Advertisers are finding that their ad targeting is really bad and that the ad fraud is really high, and yet the ad costs keep going up. So everyone's getting screwed. And that's enshittification, right? It's this process where the platform takes control of both sides, the buyers and the sellers. They drain all the value off of both of them. They leave just enough to keep users locked in and then businesses locked to users. But the real question is why, right? And the answer in short is policy. I've been doing this, as I said, for like more than 2 decades with EFF. And I've watched as policymakers proposed different courses of action that had the foreseeable and foreseen outcome of producing what I call the enshittigenic policy environment, where the worst ideas of the very worst people make the most money. And they did it even though we warned them. And here we are, right? We're living in the Enshitticene, the era in which everything is turning into shit. And it's because of policy. It's not because you didn't shop carefully enough. The idea that voting with your wallet is going to solve things. It's like the idea that recycling really hard will stop the wildfires, right? You're not going to shop your way out of a monopoly. It's not even the fault of the horrible people who run these companies. They were always horrible, but they ran the companies in a way that was far more humane and generous until they had the chance to make a lot of money without being humane and generous and not have to worry about losing our business and not have to worry about getting sued and not have to worry about losing a critical part of their workforce and not have to worry about new companies showing up that unrig the market. And then they got worse. So it's the policy environment. And that's why EFF matters. I mean, EFF matters for a lot of reasons, but if you can't solve these problems by shopping really hard, and you have to solve them at the policy level, you need to be part of a policy shop. You need to be involved in groups that are working to move policy. And that's us. That's EFF.
Yeah, thank you for that very informative sort of sketching out of the situation. I think hearing you talk, it makes me think that there is this kind of myth in Silicon Valley, but it just and I think in general in this very neoliberal, atomized individualist age, that you as an individual simply have to do the best you can. And I think there's kind of an aversion to any sort of collective effort, any idea that there is this broader environment that we must be accountable to and that we have to try to shape. And I think it sounds like everything you're saying is sort of a challenge to that, like a rebuke to the idea that the best you can do is to be an individual founder, start your own $1 billion company that isn't enshittified, right? And I wonder if maybe you could talk more about that, about how the way you describe it, and which of course I agree with, is that this isn't the situation that we're in now is not one that can be fixed by having people sort of on their own go out and try to build a better platform, right? It's, if you don't like Amazon, why don't you just build a better Amazon? Why is that? And why do you think this myth is so strong? Because it does really feel like there is so much driving force behind this idea that, if you don't like the way tech platforms are now, you should just start a better one.
Well, look, every myth has got a little grain of truth. And it is true that tech is a force multiplier for individual action. People can do more with technology than they can do without it. And with software, because it's like infinitely reproducible at no cost all around the world, we have seen people who made very small interventions in the world in terms of software that rippled out in ways that were very large. Some of them are bad, people who write malware, and some of them have been very good. One of our founders at EFF, John Gilmore, I can't even count the number of different discrete blobs of code he personally wrote that everyone ended up using, and that changed the world. Starting with the very first independent social space on the internet, which was called the alt hierarchy, which is part of Usenet. And John was just like, the people who run Usenet don't want us to talk about anything that might get them in trouble with their bosses, which means we can't talk about sex, we can't talk about drugs, we're kind of limited on a bunch of other subjects. I'm just going to start a different Usenet. And it was bigger than all of Usenet within a couple of months. But the thing that John had going for him, the thing that allowed one person to make such a big, to use a tech phrase, dent in the universe, was that he could unilaterally modify an existing service, and you as the user of that service could choose to make use of that unilateral modification. It's something we call adversarial interoperability, which is like, I counted the number of syllables in it once, and it basically, I think any phrase with like more than 4 syllables might as well have infinity. So I don't blame people if they don't want to use it, but we've tried to come up with other terms for it. It just doesn't. We tried calling it competitive compatibility, or COMCOM for short. No one used that. So adversarial interoperability is making one thing work with another. And with tech, we can do so much with adversarial interoperability. There's so many examples of small firms and individuals, stepping in and saying, hey, I'm going to make like a privacy blocker for this app that everyone uses, so that when you use it, no one can get your data. When they do that, the ground shifts, right? Firms suddenly have to change their conduct, because suddenly becomes a real choice about whether your data is being gathered or not. And they have to be much more parsimonious and much more trustworthy, because you can really make a choice. And what we've done in the last 20 some years, we've basically extinguished adversarial interoperability. And we've replaced it with policies that are favorable to monopolies. So some of those are IP laws. We have this thing called anti-circumvention law. In the US, the law is Section 1201 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, even more syllables. But it's a law that makes it illegal to modify technology without permission. And so, like an open technology, like a web browser, anyone can write a plugin for it and change how it works. We do have ad blockers and privacy blockers for browsers, and more than half of the internet using world, 51% of web users have installed that blocker. Doctorow calls it the largest consumer boycott in history. But that just doesn't exist for apps, right? Because it's illegal. It's a felony under Section 12.1 of the DMCA. And so, maybe you could make a platform that was better than Facebook and that people wanted to use, but they would have to want to use it more than they'd want to talk to their friends, because they can't convince their friends to all come over at once. Now, Mark Zuckerberg actually had a solution for this. When he was starting Facebook and trying to get users off of MySpace, he just gave those users a bot. And you gave that bot your login and password, and went to MySpace several times a day and grabbed everything waiting for you, put it in your Facebook feed, and you replied to it and pushed it back out to MySpace. But you do that to Mark Zuckerberg today, he'll nuke you till you blow, right? And so while I think that there are like, I am suspicious of saying, well, just as an individual, go off and do stuff. I do think that like one of the reasons people who are in tech think that an individual can do stuff is that there have been times when they did, right? And it would be nice to see some of that come back. I think maybe we've overcorrected even a little on the kind of tech critical side where we hate phrases like move fast and break things. I think it depends on whose things you're breaking. You want to break Mark Zuckerberg's things, that's fine. Don't move fast and break. I think it's like telling jokes. You shouldn't punch down. You should only punch up. The people whose things you break should be the people who have, us all locked in and are abusing us. Break their things all day long, and so to make that change, right, to get to a world where the make a dent in the universe becomes a viable course of action again, we need to move policy. And that's not a thing you move individually. You can't really like hack policy. Our executive director, Cindy Cohen, very long suffering, has spent the last 35 years having hackers come up to her and say, like, I figured out a loophole in the law. And they explain something to her. And she's like, yeah, the judge is just going to laugh at you and put you in jail. Right. And so, you got to like actually move the levers of policy to then open up the space to actually have some of that ability to do cool stuff on your own.
I like the idea of harnessing that that much maligned motto, move fast and break things, but in a almost like a revolutionary direction, like what are the structures of power that can be challenged in that way?
Yeah. Move fast and break things is the phrase that I use sometimes. Very cute, but
I like it. I think the way you describe how the tech industry used to be, when it was possible for someone like Mark Zuckerberg to move fast and break things and disrupt this incumbent, it really does feel like the ground has shifted so much that the tech industry, or just, not even the industry, the internet used to feel like a frontier. It used to feel like things were kind of provisional, ground hadn't yet been carved up. There was still a chance to really shape what it looks like. And maybe the ground has shifted so much, but it feels like the myths around the internet have not shifted, have not adapted. And there is still this idea that, just some genius Harvard dropout can establish this thing and completely reshape how it works. And it kind of doesn't feel like this, like you're saying, we have all these monopolies that are some of the biggest companies in the world, the most powerful, the most wealthy, obviously have a lot of lobbying power and have these, multinational branches. And it's really hard to see them as anything but these kind of monuments. It's like they're so powerful, they're so huge. And I wonder if maybe this is a way to shift to the next part of the conversation. What can we do about enshittification? What would it take to get the internet to a place that felt a little bit more like some sort of frontier not necessarily a frontier, but just like a place where things could change, a place that wasn't, a set of walled gardens dominated by these giant corporations that aren't, behaving in our best interests? What would it take to shake that up and make it feel like something a little bit more open?
Yeah, I call it the new good internet. And sometimes I call it the post-American internet. I was EFF's first European director, although it's been years since I had that job. But in that capacity, I worked in 31 countries around the world for EFF. And I talked to policy people all over the place, government officials and so on. And they all said the same thing, which is like, oh, well, these ideas you have for how, we could go into business, like reverse engineering, modifying and improving America's tech exports, make money in our own country, but also protect our people's data and their privacy. All of that stuff sounds very good, but the U.S. Trade Representative will whack us with tariffs if we do that. So, happy Liberation Day. Deterrents only work until you use them. If someone threatens to burn your house down unless you do as you're told, and you do it, and they burn your house down anyway, you don't have to keep doing what they told you to do. And I think the other thing that kept people kind of locked into the American platforms and into American policy and not wanting to make them angry is that they were willing to believe that America's big platforms would act as neutral brokers, despite all the evidence to the contrary. I mean, we had a guy walk into EFF in 2005, and he said, my name is Mark Klein. I'm a retired AT&T technician. My boss had me build an illegal secret monitoring room in the Folsom Street switching station so that we could help the NSA spy on the whole internet. So that's how long we've known. Like we sued the NSA over that. And, a few years later, a young, impressionable intelligence service contractor watched his boss lie to Congress about this, and his name was Edward Snowden. And so if Mark Klein didn't convince us, then Snowden sure should have, that, America's spying on and could also cut off the internet to all these places. So I think we all were like, around the world, people were like, yeah, they could, but they wouldn't. There's too much riding on it. They get too much benefit from it. Fundamentally, the American policy realm is a realm of rational actors, and they don't want to blow up the good thing. They want to maintain the equilibrium. Well, that's not Trump, right? And I've been saying lately when I give talks that, like, if your roof leaks, you might put a bucket under the leak, and if it leaks some more, you might put another bucket out because it's just one more leak, and you can keep doing that until like your floor is all buckets. But when the ceiling collapses, then you got to move. And I think Trump is really good at caving in the ceiling. He's really made it clear that you can't trust the American internet. So I have a lot of hope right now that some of our trading partners or former trading partners around the world are going to wake up and say, if Trump wants to steal Greenland, he doesn't need to roll tanks into nuke. He can just like ask Microsoft to do to the Danish government what they did for him to the High Court in Brazil, to the Chief Justice of the International Criminal Court. Just shut off all of their accounts to punish them for taking actions that Trump didn't like. And if that doesn't work, well, we all remember when those Russian soldiers stole $6 million worth of John Deere tractors from Ukraine and sent them to Chechnya, and the John Deere company sent a kill signal to those tractors. Well, that means that Trump could shut down all the tractors in Denmark too, right? And so there's only one way to fix this, and it's to rip out all the unauditable, opaque, remote-controlled, untrustworthy, proprietary software and replace it with transparent, public, international, open public goods that everyone can see and everyone can validate, and that you can run locally on servers in your own country. And I think we're closer to that than we've ever been. And I think it's like it should be kind of table stakes for like a good digital future is that people and the countries they live in have the final say over the technology they use. Now, if you're in America, that may be cold comfort. I mean, I do think that Americans will benefit a great deal from this. Like all the best Americans, I'm Canadian. And so I'm very aware that Canada is able to sell reasonably priced pharmaceuticals to Americans using the American Postal Service. And so, if Americans can figure out how to buy insulin from Winnipeg, they can figure out how to buy software from Denmark over the internet. And so I think a grateful nation of Americans would be very happy to avail themselves of these tools too. The way you solve these issues domestically, though, is by getting involved in groups that are working to make a change. One of the things that's become very apparent to EFF and to many other people around America is that local tech policy, like literally at the level of your city, makes a huge difference, right? It's the difference between, whether or not you have flock cameras that allow ICE to like round up your neighbors and send them to a Salvadoran slave labor camp. And local politics are a lot more movable than international or national or even state politics. And so, getting involved at that level, EFF has resources for that. We have a thing called the Atlas of Surveillance, where we are compiling a compendium of all of the every instance of a surveillance technology in municipal or state hands all across the country. There are other groups like FULU, F-U-L-U, that have wikis where they're documenting every single instance of enshittification for a kind of like an evidentiary record that policymakers can lean on. So there's a lot of opportunities out there.
Yeah, I mean, this is a horrible thing to say, but if there is a silver lining of the Trump administration, I feel like it is in sort of shifting the political understanding of the tech industry, where I think during the Obama years, it almost felt like, well, if tech companies are accountable to the US government, if maybe that's fine, maybe that's good if maybe they're beholden to the government. And now that Trump is at the helm, it really shows the problem with that whole argument. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's also showing up this technology security and business model, which we sometimes called curated computing, which, I don't think there's anything wrong with the idea that like someone out there you trust has made a list of software they think is good and you follow their recommendations. It's great. Like my first kind of real internet experience was I was on bulletin board systems, like pre-internet bulletin board systems, and browsers and like networking stacks and FTP clients and emails started to like become available. And I put together a thing called the Internet Starter Kit on a bunch of local BBSs, which I just kept up to date for people who had modems but had never connected to the internet. That was curated computing. That's fine. But the kind of curated computing we have now is so paternalistic and authoritarian. It's the idea that if like we allow you to install software that Apple doesn't think you should have, you will choose so unwisely that it will compromise your security and your life will be ruined. And the problem with that is that while Apple often makes wise choices that are responsive to the needs and well-being of their users, they also make choices that are responsive to the needs and well-being of their shareholders at the expense of their users. And the most recent example of this is that there was an app called IceBlock that warned you whether there was like a guy in plate carrier and a gator and a pair of Oakleys in your neighborhood wanted to shoot you in the face. And Apple took that app out of the App Store because they said ICE agents are a protected class, right? And so, delegating all of your decision making about how your technology works to a for-profit entity or even a nonprofit entity in a way that you cannot ever override is one of those things that works very well but fails really badly.
Yeah, I mean, hearing you describe sort of pre-internet BBS days and curation, I think that really highlights just how different the experience of being online is now, where yes, there is curation happening, but like you said, it's usually at the whims of some for-profit corporation that is probably trying to make money off you in some sketchy way. It really does feel like just being online all the time, you're bombarded with all these things that you kind of know are trying to make money from you in these really nefarious ways, pushing you to some sort of gambling, some kind of really esoteric, strange form of gambling, making you look at all these sketchy ads all the time. It's like that is just the experience of being online. And it is such a shame because it feels like such a far cry from what the internet could have been and what the, maybe 90s, 2000s utopian dreams of the internet were. I mean, for me, when I first started spending time online, I got involved in all these open source communities and really fell in love with this very naive and utopian idea of, the internet the idea of software eating the world seemed like a good thing at the time because it felt like software was some sort of democratizing force. I don't know why I believed that. It was just, I was young and naive, but in recent years, it really feels like that dream is kind of dead, or at least not within reach. And I wonder if maybe we can move on to this topic that is in the notes. What is it that what would a better internet look like? I don't need you to tell us all the details, but more just like help us understand what would it look like to have an internet that isn't guided by these authoritarian commercial entities that we can't trust. What would that in practice look like, and how do we build towards that world?
Well, let me speak briefly in defense of the idea of software as a democratizing force, because I think your intuition was right. I think the error that people make is what you might call teleology, the idea that software must be a democratizing force. And I don't know that was ever a fallacy EFF fell for. I mean, you don't start an organization like EFF or go to work for it if you think it's all going to be fine, right? You have to be alive to the possibility that it could go very wrong. I mean, in my other life, I'm a cyberpunk writer. I mean, this is an entire genre devoted to how software goes wrong. But software does have these unique characteristics. So on the one hand, you're a technologist, you know this, that there's something quite satisfying about writing software. You know, it's like it's first of all, you make the computer do exactly what you tell it to do, and also the computer only does exactly what you tell it to do. So all of the mistakes the computer makes are your mistakes, and so you find out about your own blind spots by programming computers. You get better at. I mean, and then the collaborative opportunities with free and open source software are so exciting and communitarian. So, you know, there's a lot of reasons to like software, and the fact that software objects are instantaneously globally reproducible at effectively no cost means that if you figure out a way to help someone else, you can just help them. And you know, like if you have a neighbor who can fix small engines and your blender dies, your neighbor can come over and fix it. But your neighbor can't go to your uncle's place and fix his blender halfway across the world. But if your neighbor is a software person who solves a problem you have, then your uncle halfway across the world can also use that fix. So there is something quite amenable to helping people that is built into software. And so what does a good internet look like? It's one in which people can help themselves and each other when things don't go well. You know, I wrote a utopian novel that came out in 2017 called Walk Away, that some people think is dystopian because it's a world in which things have gone wrong. But the reason it's utopian is it's a world where people are trying to fix them. And look, things going wrong is not optional. You know, the second law of thermodynamics is not up for negotiation, right? It's just like built in, and assuming things will never go wrong does not make you an optimist. It makes you a danger to yourself and others, right? Assuming nothing will go wrong is like the logic that says, why do we need lifeboats on the Titanic? It's unsinkable, right? So I think for me, a utopian world is one in which when things go wrong, as they inevitably do because of exogenous shocks, climate shocks, zoonotic plagues, comets hitting your planet, sunspots, tsunamis, you know, when things go wrong, you can fix them, right? When the machine stops, we can get it started again. That's, for me, a hopeful vision of the future. And so a new good internet, is one in which when things don't work the way you want them to, you can fix them. And if you can't fix them, you can ask someone else to fix them for you. And if they want to fix them, they can for you. And if not, you have the resources to learn how to fix them for yourself. It's not perfect, right? There will always be differential access to the ability to change technology, the ability to pay other people to change technology for you. Technology will always be imperfect. There'll always be defects and security vulnerabilities in our technology, and it will always be a work in progress. And the question is where the locus of control lies, right? As a science fiction writer, I think that the most interesting and important fact about a technology is not what it does, but who it does it for and who it does it to. And, you know, those social relations, if they're up for grabs, then I think we can have not a perfect internet, but a perfecting internet, an improving internet, one that is always changing to meet the moment. And to be, I'm sorry, I know I spoke a long time there, but to be the nervous system that we need to coordinate the collective action we're going to need to survive genocide and the climate emergency and rising fascism. Because as someone who grew up wheat pasting posters to get people out to a demonstration all night through a Toronto winter night with a bucket of you know, flour and water and a stack of flyers on my bicycle basket, like, if you think you can organize a mass movement without digital technology, I want you to spend a couple of sub-zero nights with a bucket of wheat paste and tell me what you think after that.
This is why I like talking to you. You're so optimistic, and that always makes me. I think I'm naturally a little bit of a pessimistic person, and so my next question is going to be a little bit pessimistic, and I'm hoping you can turn it around. But I mean, on the topic of software going wrong, and also on the topic of locus of control, right? I think maybe this is a good way to segue into talking about AI, because that's one where you could kind of argue that you see a lot of instances of software going wrong in the way AI is being pushed on us, the way AI is obscuring certain social relations, the way AI is being used as an excuse to enact mass layoffs. I mean, even just the other day, Cisco, despite record revenues, right, mass layoffs. And I think with AI, what is really interesting about it that I feel like is not being discussed enough is the extent to which the locus of control is shifting and being obscured and being put into this kind of black box. I think maybe 20 years ago, if you were learning how to code, you could look at the source code for something, and you can kind of like figure out how everything works. Today, if you're learning how to code and you're a young person, you're probably vibe coding. You're probably using this magic box, and you don't really know how it works. You don't really have any way of changing it. The best you can do is kind of prompt it in an interesting way, but it's still this kind of like magical demon that you don't really understand how it was built or what choices were used in training the data. You don't really know where the data comes from. And I feel like that teaches young people, especially, to have such a different relationship to technology, one that I think is kind of worrisome. So I wonder if you could, maybe tell us about what AI is, what this sort of AI bubble is doing to the way the internet is developing and the way things are changing, but also, what might come out of it. Because I know, I'm sure you have kind of like an optimistic way to look at it.
Well, a hopeful one. I don't know. I'm not much of an optimist, but I'm very hopeful. You don't have to be happy to be hopeful, right? You can be miserable and see how things might get better. It doesn't mean you're happy. I'm not happy that the Strait of Hormuz is shut, but I'm very hopeful that we're doing mass demand destruction for carbon-intensive fossil fuels that will never return, right? It's still awful and terrifying, right? But it is hopeful. So as with every complicated issue, there's so much kind of sort of glommed together there that unless you tease it apart, it can be really hard to make sense of it. So on the one hand, I think we need to acknowledge that software development has grown more and more abstracted from the bare metal since like we were setting dip switches on panels, or since a primarily female workforce, we should say, was cross connecting electromechanical relays with wires, right? So we are a lot further away from the metal. I actually grew up with a wonderful little computing teaching device called the Cardiac that came from Bell Labs, and it's a cardboard computer, and you assemble it. It's like papercraft. And you write little programs, and then you have this like little book that tells you how to execute the program. You move these little counters around. And the Cardiac, which you can download, there's copies online, you can download, print the PDF and make your own. It was developed by a Bell Labs guy who was really worried that now that we were programming computers with assembly language, that people were losing track of setting dip switches and what was going on like on the metal when you wrote software, and that they wouldn't be able to understand it. And that person was right. I mean, I want to say, right, like a lot of the optimizations that we get out of computers and a lot of the debugging we do and a lot of the subtle and important things that we learn about computers comes from understanding it at these low abstraction layers. But at the same time, no one writes software that way anymore. And so at every generation, at every turn, there's been someone saying, kids today, they don't know how easy they've got it. They're working so far up the abstraction layer that they'll never understand what's going on in the important layer, which is, of course, the layer that was the top layer when I started programming, and so on and so on. So we should say that, but at the same time, we can understand that these highly concentrated AI companies lose more money than any other companies in the history of the world. That they have no path to profitability that anyone can articulate that's remotely credible. That there is a strong likelihood that a lot of these tools that people rely on are going to go away. That while there are programmers who use these tools in ways that produce extremely high quality software at a pace and with a reach that they weren't able to get before. I'm thinking particularly of my friend Patrick Ball, who's a friend of EFF and founded a nonprofit called the Human Rights Data Analysis Group, who's using software agents to help him write code for things like parsing through all of the arrest records from New Orleans in collaboration with the Innocence Project New Orleans to find linguistic correlates of work that led to in arrest reports that led to successful exoneration as the top of a funnel for doing exoneration work, and that it's making their work much more effective. but that everyone I know who's really effective and is producing effective quality code that's maintainable and that doesn't have a bunch of lurking bugs and they can use with a high degree of confidence, they're very senior and very skilled. And they learned those skills by working at a lower level of abstraction, which allows them to work at the higher level of abstraction with this. And I think the worrisome thing, apart from the idea that these foundation models switch off and then everyone has learned to vibe code, doesn't have their tools anymore, which is a thing I think we should worry about. And also the concern that, is being used to discipline labor and make people's lives worse. And also that there's this climate dimension. I think the other thing we should be worrying about is we are starving the pipeline of the skilled coders who can evaluate the output. We don't have a plausible path to a sufficiently high degree of reliability of the output of LLM coding agents that you don't need those skills. It's not like a compiler where we made the compilers good enough that even if you couldn't read assembler, you could still trust the output of the compiler sort of 99.9% of the time. We are, that we're not on a path to anything like more than I think maybe, 80%, 75%, which is nowhere near high enough for production code, especially production code that's in your like anti-lock brakes and your pacemaker and your government,
Yeah, I mean, to the point about compilers, I think that's a great symbol, because to me, a compiler is something that is deterministic, mathematically sound, reproducible, understandable, whereas now what we have are a lot of these essentially stochastic systems that, and there's something kind of that feels fundamentally scary about trusting these things with, especially if we don't have people who can evaluate their output and they're being used in ways that are, about displacing workers and essentially, getting rid of the people who could theoretically evaluate them.
Well, I think there's a really useful framework for this, and it's why it's in the title of my next book, The Reverse Centaur's Guide to Life After AI. And it's this idea of centaurs and reverse centaurs. So in automation theory, the centaur is the person assisted by the machine, whether that's a spell checker or a bicycle or an LLM. And a reverse centaur is someone who's conscripted to help the machine. So for people of a certain age, you'll know the I Love Lucy episode where Lucy and Ethel are having to pick the chocolates off the conveyor belt and put them in the box. And the conveyor belt is running so quickly that they lose track of it. This is an old beat, right? We see it in Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times. We see it actually anywhere automation is introduced by capital, because labor likes automation too, right? You don't find woodworkers who are like, I would rather gnaw this sculpture out of a log with my own teeth, right? They want chisels and hammers. Automation is like a thing that workers like, but when workers are in charge of automation, they historically and typically choose automation that improves quality. And when capital is in charge of automation, because they own an asset that is amortizing on a certain schedule and that they need to get a return out of, they run that automation at the maximum speed at the expense of quality in order to produce quantity. And so a worker who's in charge of which tools they use still might choose unwisely. A woodworker might take their thumb off with the chisel, right? But workers are best suited to make those calls ultimately about which tools they're going to use and how. And to your point earlier about, the promises of these AI companies about how well they're going to work, and how that contrasts with the fact that they have to force people to use them or trick people into using them. A tool that's that good, you wouldn't have to force people to use. It would just come naturally. I keep finding educators who are like, how are we going to train children to use LLMs? And I'm like, guys, there's a $1.4 trillion industry that's trying to get kids to use LLMs. Why do we need more public resources to get them to use LLMs? It's like committing public resources to getting them to like vape, right? Like there is no shortage of private capital trying to get them to adopt this technology. If anything, we need public resources, maybe a brake and not an accelerator on that process.
I think your the way you pinpointed the difference between tools that are useful to workers and tools that are useful to capital is probably the thing that I keep coming back to. Mm-hmm. And I mean, one of the things that's very frustrating about this new AI bubble and this discourse about automation is the conflation of these different types of tooling and automation, because there is such a difference, and yet it's all being pushed on us as if it's one, as if, people should welcome automation that makes their job easier. But of course, that the specific tooling that is being introduced is used in a way that actually deprives them of power at the workplace, or
Sure.
even makes them obsolete. There's this book by David Noble called Forces of Production. I don't know if you've, yeah. And that, I mean, that was probably the best thing I read in a while. And that's all about in the history of the automobile industry. It's about the difference between a kind of automation that would have been good for the workers and a kind of automation that is good for management, in that it allows management to consolidate some of the knowledge, the techniques, the skills that the workers have developed, and put it inside this management-friendly automation technology. And I think that is a history that people aren't aware of, and maybe it's something we should be careful about.
So I have one gloss I want to put on that, because I think that it's possible to hear that and say, well, I wish workers well, but the point of workers is like the point of, say, a radiology department is to fight cancer, not employ radiologists. And so if we can fight cancer without employing quite so many radiologists, and we can fight it better, and we can add more, we can, make radiology too cheap to meter with automation, then, I wish them all the best, and I hope that they find gainful employment in their future. But I don't want to get cancer. And, as it happens, this is a personal matter for me. I have a thankfully very treatable form of cancer, but I've given a lot of thought to this business. And the thing is, there's no one at a hospital right now from an AI company saying, look, guys, here's the pitch. Right now, you're spending $1 million a year on radiologists, and each radiologist does 100 x-rays a year. Tell you what, give me another $500,000 a year, and I'm going to give you some software, and it's going to double check the results of the radiologists. And where they disagree, the radiologist is going to go back and have another look. And so now your radiologists are only going to check 98 x-rays a day, and you're going to pay an extra $500,000 a year for software licensing fees. That, like, no one's investing in an AI company on the basis that they think that that pitch will be successful, and no AI company is pitching a hospital administrator that way. The pitch at the hospital is fire 90% of your radiologists, split the wage savings with the AI company, have the remaining radiologists put their name at the bottom of the radiology reports from the AI, and they take the blame when someone dies of cancer. Dan Davies calls it an accountability thing. There's a researcher, I just blanked her name, but she calls them moral crumple zones. And this shows you the extent to which how the machine works is less important than who it works for and who it works against.
Great. Well, that's I think at that point, maybe we should wrap up our conversation, switch over to audience questions. So there's a great question here from, I'm not sure if I need to say the name, Morebroad_Jacob. Thank you. Question: if there's still time, please comment on the process that our knowledge is more and more placed in software, and that our knowledge is more and more placed behind walls or paywalls. It's like going back to the time before Gutenberg, when knowledge only existed inside the monasteries. The knowledge all of us had in our brains is shifting over to being placed behind different kinds of walls. I love this question. This is something I think about a lot. I've been thinking about the idea of cognitive sovereignty, and in the wake of all these AI companies, I mean, OpenAI openly coming out and saying they want to treat intelligence as a utility, right, to be privatized and this sort of corporate asset. And I think that is a very scary future to me. And it feels like this is what the entire AI bubble is resting on, this kind of privatization, putting knowledge that should belong to all of humanity behind these different kinds of walls.
Yeah, so obviously, like this idea of intellectual property is an area that has been very contentious for EFF and more broadly within the kind of tech and rights world for a long time, for lots of different reasons. We've seen, on the one hand, the enclosure of things like indigenous knowledge. And on the other hand, we've seen the expansion of the scope and duration of copyrights and other forms of knowledge capture that allow firms to sort of enclose public domain or ideas that are sort of floating around in the ether and exclude other people from them. And we know that this is like on the one hand, like just as a kind of instrumental matter, not good. Like if you're not allowed to inspect how the systems work, then even if the people running them are benevolent, unless they're also perfect, they'll make mistakes. And those mistakes won't be caught. You know, Bruce Schneier says anyone can design a security system that works so well that they themselves can't think of a way of breaking it. It doesn't mean that it actually works, just means it works on people stupider than them. And you know, like the reason we have the scientific method is because, like, in the absence of it, you know, people kidded themselves into thinking that drinking mercury was good for them, right? It was only when they exposed their beliefs to adversarial peer review that we made something truly alchemical. We took the base metal of superstition and turned it into the precious metal of knowledge. At the same time, I think that the reification of IP has been a sleight of hand, because so much of what matters to our civilization and to the fortunes of a company is not intellectual property. It's what's called sometimes process knowledge, sometimes asset knowledge. They don't mean exactly the same thing, but they're like in the same world. So process knowledge is like, don't feed the goo into this machine faster than this, otherwise it will jam. And if it jams and the technician is on holiday, the person who used to do it retired last year, and this is their cell phone number, and for $100 they'll come in and unjam it. And that process knowledge is the difference between profit and loss, right? It's the difference between the factory shuts down for a week until the guy who knows how to unjam it comes back from vacation, or the factory's back up and running in an hour. And to give you a recent example of how well process knowledge works, there was someone in Apple's supply chain who made a load of chips, a gigantic batch of chips that failed QA and could not be run at the nominal clock speed that they had been manufactured. And they knew that there was a product group within Apple that had been thinking about making a low-end MacBook. And they called them up and they said, do you want a bunch of chips that only run slow for like really cheap that we were going to throw away? And they said, yeah, we'll make the MacBook Neo. It was the most successful new product launch that Apple's had in 10 years. It's been so successful, they're now just manufacturing chips to run slower because they've run out of defective chips, right? So why don't we pay attention to process knowledge? Well, process knowledge is the stuff that looks like IP, but that you can't write down, you can't patent, you can't sell, you can't abstract, you can't commodify. And so we don't value it, but we know it's worth a lot of money because, you know, we have this thing in labor called a work to rule. And work to rule is when you say, I am just going to follow the rules. It's not like I'm going to break the rules. That's a strike. I'm going to follow the rules. Turns out to be just as devastating as a strike, because the rules have to be shaped at the margins by process knowledge or they fail completely. And that process knowledge is missing from AI, right? Because an AI can only be trained on the parts that you can write down or observe or infer, right? And the process knowledge is like this tacit stuff floating around, communally owned. It crosses boundaries within firms and across firms, and it's not in the training data. So it is this kind of big lacuna in all of this. And so in addition to, you know, this kind of regression that we're going through, there's also this omission that is getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. It's like, it's, you know, each system that we build is even more contemptuous of process knowledge and even more central to how we run the world, and thus even more unsuited.
I have a question here from Mason Avik. Sorry if I'm saying that wrong. What's the best balance between state and non-state solutions to enshittification?
Yeah, I think that what we should do is we should have state intervention in a way that maximizes how many other actors of other kinds, including other kinds of state actors, can intervene in the system as a way of pluralizing power. So to give you an example, we could say, all right, from now on, all the internet that we get is going to be fiber, and it's going to be provided by the municipal government and run by the municipal government, which means that maybe like Eric Adams is your ISP, right? We could all see why that would be bad. Actually, my favorite podcast right now is this podcast called No Gods, No Mayors, and it's run by our mutual friends from the Trash Future podcast. And the thesis of this show is the highest office to which an oaf can aspire is the mayoralty. And the stories of mayors around the world and through time is the story of just the most gratuitous oafishness we can imagine. So we don't want your mayor to necessarily be your ISP and your content moderator and all the rest of it. We can all understand how that would go wrong. At the same time, when we let the private sector decide whether or not we're going to get fiber, their answer is, no, you pig, copper is fine for you. It was good enough for your grandma, and it's going to be good enough for your grandkids. Who needs more than like DSL speeds, right? And so what's the balance? Well, what if the city puts in the conduit, which they have to do anyway? Even if the private sector is putting in conduit, they have to clear it with the city. There's no way the private sector can dig up all the streets in town, in a purely private matter. By the time they've paid for the rights of way for everything, they'll have grossly exceeded all the expected returns from the fiber network. So the city puts in the conduit, the city puts in fiber, and the city builds a data center where the fiber head ends all coalesce so that they can run an ISP. And the city rents you space in that data center if you want to start an ISP. So you can rent a shelf. It's called essential facility sharing. If you remember the days when you could get DSL from 50 companies, that was before George Bush's FCC shut down essential facility sharing. But when we had it, we had lots of people providing DSL over AT&T's copper, over the incumbent company's copper. And they rent out space in the conduit. So if you want, as Sonic did in San Francisco, where they built a fully parallel network, you could build a parallel network, but without digging up the streets. Or maybe you've got like San Francisco State and you've got like 2 different campuses and you don't want to join them up through a data center that's owned by the city because it's weird and inefficient. Why would you switch that network? And you run a piece of point-to-point fiber from the 2 campuses. So now you've got this thing where you can be an ISP by running your own fiber or by renting space in the data center. And you've got these different layers of control. And so the control is spread out. It's not perfect, right? But what there is there's friction in the system if any one actor wants to censor or interdict or mismanage the network. There are alternatives that you can fall back on. There are disciplining forces. If the city wants to keep your business as the municipal ISP, they have to be good. That's I think the model for it. And you can imagine that in like software development, where maybe the city or the government runs a Mastodon server, but also contributes to Mastodon. So you can run a Mastodon server and also has data centers where you can stand up your own Mastodon server, but also has tooling. So other data centers can stand up a Mastodon server and you have the network that's federated. And so it's not just like one locus of control, it's this pluralized set of power.
Great. I think we have time for one last question. This is from Deadly XOWO. That's funny. What are some of the most impactful things we can do right now? An optimistic note to end us.
Yeah, look, there are lots of cool tools, even in this enshittified era, that you can use that would make your life marginally better. In the book, I talk about how I switched from Google to a company called Kagi. EFF doesn't endorse Kagi, I should say, and they don't pay me anything. I don't have a relationship with them. They just sometimes send me emails thanking me for saying nice things about them. But it's a search engine. It's very good. It's $10 a month. I really like it. And it makes your life better. I think federated social media like Mastodon and Blue Sky will make you happier than Facebook and Twitter. And if you're lucky enough that you aren't connected to communities there that you can't leave and that are, not so important to you that you can't bear to part ways with them, then you could go to one of these other services. But if you really want to make an impact, you got to get involved as part of a polity. And that's what I've been saying all through this call. Join EFF, contribute to the Atlas of surveillance, get involved in local politics, start a union or join a union. If you work in tech, look up the Tech Workers Collective, look up Tech Solidarity, figure out how to get involved in labor organizing. Solidarity is the opposite of fascism. The reason fascist movements target organized labor first is because that's where the organized resistance is. And you're in good company. More Americans want to join a union now than at any time in recorded history. And fewer Americans are in unions now than have been in generations. And so this is a situation with an obvious solution, which is to join and start a union. and be that polity, be part of that group. Go out to your No Kings demonstration and use our surveillance self-defense kit to stay safe while you're there, and make the friends who are going to be around to help you when problems come, because there's like I said, there's even the most idyllic society is subject to these exogenous shocks, and things will go wrong in the future. And when it does, you want to be the person who's helping your neighbors, and you want your neighbors to come and help you.
I think that's a beautiful note to end on. Thank you for that, Cory.
Thank you. Oh, Mitch, your mic is off. Now it's a Zoom call. Someone has
Now
spoken
it
with
is a
their
Zoom
mic off.
call. Guilty as charged. Thank you both, Wendy and Cory, for this amazing discussion, and thank you to everyone who contributed to the chat, who asked excellent questions, and everyone watching around the world. Our collaboration, all of us, is so important. While I and others on the legal team can explain to a court why the terms of service on a website and anti-hacking laws don't stop someone from writing a script that lets them comparison shop, it's Cory and the activism team who will come up with something that sticks in your mind and it really grabs you by the gut. Like, there is no such thing as felony contempt of business model. Right. And then it's our technology team will come up with something like Privacy Badger that with a click allows you to make that a reality. A Privacy Badger don't care about your business model.
Awesome.
So digital rights begin with you. We can only do this work in partnership with all of you. EFF has been a leader in privacy, freedom of expression, and innovation for 35 years, but we can only continue to do this with your help. So please take 10 minutes right now and become an EFF member. It's EFF.org/support change. Please continue these conversations about civil liberties with your colleagues and friends. Cory has given us some tips on where to get started. And when you're done renewing your EFF membership, be sure to mark your calendar for the next Affecting Change, which will be June 17th. It will be Pride Month, and we'll be talking about digital rights and the LGBTQ+ community. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Mitch. And thank you so much, Wendy. It was so kind of you to take your time to work on this. I'm such a huge admirer of your work.
Likewise, I'm very honored to be asked, and this is very, very informative and inspiring.
Thank you.